Residents of a tiny Indonesian island are suing a Switzerland-based cement maker for its role in exacerbating climate change. The plaintiffs allege that global emissions caused by Holcim have contributed to sea level rise around their home, Pari Island. And they want the Swiss firm to pay up and agree to cut emissions.
These roots hold the future for Pari Island. Asmania and her friends are planting mangroves. Once mature, the trees will serve as a natural barrier to seawater erosion and reduce the risk of floods on the 42-hectare island, which lies just off the coast of Jakarta.
Jangan tunggu kami tenggelam. Save Pari!
Don't wait until we sink. Save Pari Island. That is their message, and it's a message they have now brought to court. Asmania is one of 4 residents of Pari Island who filed a lawsuit against cement giant Holcim in Switzerland over its contribution to climate change.
Holcim itu menyumbang emisi terbesar.
Holcim is one of the world's biggest contributors to CO2 emissions, causing climate change that impacts our island. Fish stocks have declined, the seasons are unpredictable, the sea level is rising. Someone must hold Holcim responsible for these consequences of climate change.
This field, where the women of the village are planting vegetables, is one of the few left that has not been flooded by seawater in recent years. Wherever you go on the island, the struggle against the encroaching sea is obvious. Many houses are flooded at high tide, but Arif Pujianto, one of the plaintiffs, is determined to stay.
Since the constant flooding began in 2019, it's been difficult to get clean water. We used to rely on this freshwater well, but now it's even unusable for dishwashing.
The local environmental advocacy group Walhi, which backs the islanders alongside a Swiss and a German NGO, is optimistic regarding the lawsuit. A similar environmental case against Shell in the Netherlands has recently been won. But they are preparing for a legal battle that could drag on for years.
Holcim won't go bankrupt. We only demand 3 things: mitigation, adaptation and loss and damage. This means that we want to provide corrections to the existing production mode, not to bankrupt it.
The 4 islanders are suing for €14,000 in loss and damages to be shared amongst them. A comparatively small amount, but for fisherman Mustakfirin, it would make a huge difference.
They should be led by their conscience and take responsibility for what they have done. They reap so much in profit that they are blinded by it. They don't see that we are bearing the brunt of a climate emergency.
A rapid reduction in the company's carbon emissions, which the lawsuit demands, could make a difference in the long run. The plaintiffs are also demanding better flood defenses and more mangrove restoration. The fight against the sea and global injustice on Pari has just begun.
And we reached out to Holcim for a response to our report. This is what the company said, and I quote, "Climate protection has the highest priority for Holcim and is at the center of our strategy. With this objective, we are pursuing a strict science-based approach with our industry's first validated net zero goals, which conform with the 1.5 degrees Celsius path. We do not believe that court cases focusing on individual companies are an effective mechanism for surmounting the global complexity of climate change." Joining me now from Zurich is Nina Burri. She's a lawyer for the aid organization Swiss Church Aid HEX, which is supporting the Pari Islanders in their lawsuit against Holcim. Nina, Holcim does not have operations on Pari Island. How is it then responsible for climate change impacts on it?
Yes, exactly. Holcim does not have operations on Pari Island, and it stopped also its operations in Indonesia a few years ago. However, this is not for the global problem of climate change and also for the legal case, this is not required because emissions can be caused in Switzerland, Argentina, or India, and they all cause a process in the atmosphere that causes global warming and then lets sea level rise. So the impacts are felt on Pari Island regardless of where these emissions are produced. And Holcim produces emissions such a big scale in a lot of countries globally, but yes, not in Indonesia.
You're talking about a big scale based on the study that HEX, the group that you are a lawyer for, based on the study that HEX commissioned, it claims that Holcim is responsible for 0.42% of global fossil fuel and cement emissions. Does that make it 100% responsible for the climate change impacts on Pari Island?
No, it doesn't make it 100% responsible because, as you just mentioned, it's 1.42%, nearly half a percentage of all global industrial emissions since the beginning of industrialization that Holcim caused. But there are a lot of other polluters and a lot of other contributors to global climate change and then sea level rise. But the islanders, the plaintiffs, they also only ask for 0.42% of the damages. So they only ask for the share that can be attributed to Holcim, because otherwise it wouldn't be fair.
If the islanders really want damage for the damage that they're if they want, compensation for the damage that they're facing as a result of climate change, wouldn't it make more sense to go after industries that are some of the worst polluters? And the worst polluters are the fossil fuel industries. And some of the top companies in that regard are China Coal, for example, Saudi Aramco, Gazprom. This is based on the Carbon Disclosure Project report. Would it not make more sense to target those companies?
As you mentioned, there are a lot of global corporations responsible for a high share of global emissions, but Holcim is one of the 50 companies that contributed most to climate change. And it's also part of the cement industry. It's the world's biggest producer of cement. And this industry is responsible every year for up to 8% of all global emissions. This is much more, for instance, as the aviation industry. And the fossil fuel and energy companies, they have already been in the spotlight and they have already faced a number of lawsuits globally. But the cement industry is kind of second in line, and there should also be the spotlight on them. And that's why the plaintiffs chose Holcim for their lawsuit. And also Holcim causes a lot of these emissions in their first scope. That means they really are caused in their production. So they have direct control about these emissions and also about reducing them.
Climate change is caused by a complex interplay of factors, and there's very many actors, as you yourself admitted. Why target just one company?
Well, theoretically, the plaintiffs could target another company or a number of companies. But there is, as I said, you choose the company that has the biggest impact or one of the biggest impact because they're one of the biggest polluters. But on the other hand, there is also legal restrictions to who you can sue, where you can sue, if you can, for instance, file a mass claim, or just individuals can file a lawsuit. So there are also legal restrictions on where such cases can be brought because it's a transnational case. And then, of course, it's also in the end a strategic decision. And Holcim, for instance, says that it's a leader in the industry and it presents itself as very green and climate friendly. And that is just not true. And that's why they are the target of this lawsuit.
Are you also, in a way, questioning the principle of loss and damage, the principle that was agreed in the COP27 in Egypt last year? And the principle there, I believe, was about group responsibility amongst developed countries and them getting together and paying into a fund for the developing nations. Are you against that principle? Is that principle not working?
No, the principle of loss and damage is very, very important. And as you just mentioned, it was a big topic in the last COP negotiations, but it's still not addressed in an adequate way. And there are still not enough funds, especially from countries from the global north, in that fund for damages specifically in the global south. But this lawsuit actually brings that topic into the legal sphere as well, because it addresses the issues that those who have contributed nearly nothing are left alone with the damages, and they have to pay for damages that they have not contributed. And in their legal arguments, the plaintiffs really say Holcim has to follow the shared but common responsibility. That is a principle from the Paris Agreement, and namely those who have contributed most and are actually, they have the financial means and the technical means to reduce their emissions, that they have to follow up with that promise.
You're also unsatisfied with Holcim's current climate strategy. Why?
They have a strategy, as you mentioned. We also talk to them. We pose them a range of questions. We always do that and engage with corporations if we criticize them. They have answered these questions. They have a climate strategy, but the problem is they have reduction targets only per cement ton they produce, so per ton of cement. But what happened, their production increased in the last years, and so overall the emissions went up. And only in 2021, again, the emissions, they went up. And this is just not in line with the limit of the Paris Agreement, of the 1.5 degree limit, because we need absolute and drastic emission reductions. So it's not enough if you only produce a little bit less CO2 per ton of cement you produce. And overall, Holcim has produced more than 7 billion of tons of CO2, and it actually just externalized the cost to the public and to people in the global south, specifically the people on Pari Island who have to now pay for these damages.
Do you think that this case, no matter what the result is, will set a precedent in some ways?
Well, yes, it's the first case of this kind in Switzerland. So there will be these kind of questions the first time answered, and that will be a precedent. But if we look in the legal sphere, we have, for instance, already a case in the Netherlands against Shell, where a court really decided that Shell has to reduce their emissions. And we have a kind of similar or related case in a German court, where the German court just traveled to Peru to actually look at the impacts of climate change. So globally, it's a big movement of lawsuits underway, and also these cases can inspire Swiss judges on how they decide.
Nina Pari, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.